Greetings, philosophers. Today we're talking about Albert Camus, a man who stared into the void of existence and somehow came out with a cigarette in one hand and a pen in one hand the other, scribbling down thoughts that still hit us like a punch to the gut. He was a philosopher, a novelist, a playwright, and let's be honest, a bit of a rock star in the intellectual world of mid-20th century France. His life and writings are a wild ride through absurdity, rebellion, and the search for meaning in a world that doesn't seem to care. So grab a coffee or maybe something stronger and let's get into it. Albert Camus was born in 1913 in French Algeria, a place where the sun was relentless and life was tough. His father died in World War I when Camus was just a baby, leaving his mother, who was partially deaf, to raise him and his brother in a cramped working-class apartment. No electricity, no running water, just grit and survival. Young Albert was a bright kid, though, and a teacher spotted his potential, helping him get a scholarship to a fancy school. That's where the seeds of his ideas started to grow, surrounded by books, debates, and the stark contrast between his own poverty and the world of ideas he was stepping into. By the time he was in his 20s, Camus was already wrestling with big questions. He studied philosophy, got tuberculosis, which, by the way, he lived with for the rest of his life, and started writing for newspapers. He was a journalist with a knack for calling out nonsense, whether it was colonial injustice in Algeria or the creeping fascism in Europe. This was the 1930s, and the world was getting darker by the day. Camus didn't just sit back and watch. He was out there joining the French resistance during World War II, editing an underground newspaper called Combat. Imagine the guts it took to publish anti-Nazi articles while the Gestapo was sniffing around. That's the kind of man we're dealing with. Now, let's get to the heart of Camus' philosophy, because this is where things get juicy. Camus is best known for his idea of the absurd. What's that? Well, picture this. You're human. You crave meaning. You want the universe to make sense, to give you a purpose. But the universe? It just shrugs. It's silent, indifferent, like a cosmic void that doesn't care about your dreams or your existential crises. That clash between your hunger for meaning and the world's refusal to provide it is what Camus called the absurd. It's not just a fancy idea, it's the feeling you get when you're staring at the stars, wondering why you're here, and getting no answer. Camus laid this out in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, in Greek mythology, was this guy condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, only for it to roll back down every time he got close to the top. Sounds like a nightmare, right? For Camus, Sisyphus was a stand-in for all of us, stuck in a world where our efforts might not lead to some grand cosmic payoff. But here's the rub. Camus didn't think this was a reason to give up. He said we should embrace the absurd, accept that life might not have a built-in meaning and keep pushing that boulder anyway. Why? Because the act of pushing, of living, of defying the void is what makes us human. He famously wrote, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy. That's not despair, that's defiance." Now let's talk about his novels, because Camus wasn't just tossing out essays. He was weaving these ideas into stories that grab you by the collar. Take The Stranger, published in 1942. It's about Meursault, a guy in Algeria who seems oddly detached from life. His mother dies, and he doesn't cry at her funeral. He doesn't seem all that bothered by it. The book's not about excusing Meursault's actions, but about showing what it's like to live without clinging to society's usual scripts. Religion, morality, all the stuff we're told gives life meaning. Meursault's indifference freaks people out, but it's also his way of facing the absurd head-on, without illusions. When I first read it, I was shaken by how raw and honest it felt. Like Camus was daring me to look at my own life and ask, what am I pretending to believe in? Then there's The Plague, which came out in 1947. It's set in a town hit by a deadly disease, cut off from the world, where people are forced to confront suffering, death, and their own choices. On one level, it's about a literal plague, but you don't have to squint too hard to see it as a metaphor for the Nazi occupation of France, or even just the human condition. The characters in the plague don't sit around waiting for a miracle. They fight back. They help each other, even when it feels pointless. Camus called this revolt, not some grand revolution, but the quiet, stubborn choice to keep going, to act with decency, even in a world that doesn't reward it. It's like he's saying, life is absurd, but you can still choose to be a good person. Camus's life wasn't all high-minded philosophy, though. He was a bit of a character, charming, chain-smoking, a lover of soccer and women. He had a complicated relationship with the French left, especially the existentialist crowd like Jean-Paul Sartre. Camus and Sartre were buddies for a while, but they fell out over politics. Sartre was all in on communism, while Camus thought it was just another dogma that crushed human freedom. He wasn't afraid to call out hypocrisy, whether it was from the right or the left, and that made him enemies, but it also made him authentic. He wasn't chasing applause, he was chasing truth. What's wild about Camus is how he lived his ideas. He didn't just write about rebellion, he lived it, whether he was resisting Nazis or speaking out against Soviet oppression. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957, at just 44, but he wasn't one to rest on his laurels. Tragically, his life was cut short in 1960 when he died in a car crash at 46. He was carrying an unfinished manuscript, The First Man, a semi-autobiographical novel about his childhood in Algeria. Even incomplete, it's a beautiful, tender look at where he came from, a reminder that this philosopher of the absurd was at heart a guy who loved life fiercely. Camus tells us that the absurd isn't a dead end, it's a starting point. You don't need to find a grand purpose to live well. You can create meaning in the small stuff, writing a story, helping a neighbour, standing up for what's right. He's not offering a self-help manual. He's giving us permission to embrace the mess and keep going. One last thing. Camus had this knack for cutting through the fog with simple, searing truths. In The Plague, one character says, "There are more things to admire in men than to despise." That's Camus in a nutshell. Not naive, not cynical, but stubbornly hopeful. He saw the world's darkness, but chose to light a match anyway. And that, my friends, is why we're still talking about him. That's it for today. Next time we'll be diving into another big thinker who made the world a little less boring. Until then, keep pushing that boulder.